it's really sensational to have everybody back here on campus in school after, I don't know, like a month of being away or here and away or away and here. So it's incredible that we get to start our semester off with this incredible panel, and you'll excuse the formality of introducing them, which I'm going to do now, because everybody here is here because of in many ways, the three of them, but we're also videotaping it, and so everybody out there is going to know a little bit more about each one of them in a minute. So now we're going to officially start. Welcome, everybody. We are...
Sorry.
No, it's okay. We're here this afternoon at the Liner Beit Midrash of the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies. My name is Rabbi Aaron Alexander. I am one of the Associate Deans of the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies, and I'm honored to be standing next to these three sitting rabbis for a discussion that we're titling Understanding, Knowing, and Engaging God, Modern Conversation, Ancient Topic. And so I'll introduce them in the order that they are. The first is the Solon and Dorf Distinguished Service Professor in Philosophy and the Rector at the American Jewish University, Rabbi Elliot Dorf, beloved professor and teacher and rabbi to just about every conservative rabbi that I've ever met. On top of that, a few things about Rabbi Dorf. He is the chair of the Conservative Movements Committee on Jewish Law and Standards. He served on the editorial committee of Eitz Chaim, the New Torah Commentary for the Conservative Movement. He's been the past president of Jewish Family Service, member of the Ethics Committee at the UCLA Medical Center, and most importantly to him, he's a grandfather and a husband and a father. Right. And for the context of this conversation, in 1992, Rabbi Dorf published his seminal work on theology, a book that most of us have read, Knowing God, the book that Rabbi Artson has read with notes inserted.
Love on.
I know. Right. To Rabbi Dorf's right is Rabbi Jonathan Jaffe Bernhard, who is senior rabbi at Adat Ariel in Valley Village. Rabbi Bernhard has been senior rabbi since 2006. He has been at Adat Ariel for many years. He was also associate rabbi there for 10 years. He is the vice president on the executive committee of the Board of Rabbis. He's a member of the Jewish Federation Valley Alliance, and I think most importantly for the Ziegler School, for many years you've been serving as a mentor to our senior rabbinical students, preparing them for their fieldwork. So thank you, and thank you for being here. To Rabbi Bernhard's right is the Abner and Rosalind Goldstein's Dean's Chair of the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies, Rabbi Bradley Shavit Artson. He is also Vice President at American Jewish University. He teaches courses in ancient and medieval Jewish philosophy, modern and contemporary Jewish theology, homiletics, etc. Rabbi Artson is the author of the widely popular series of Torah commentaries, The Bedside Torah and The Everyday Torah, and of course the hit and bestseller, I Have Some Questions About God. You've seen that. Most importantly for this conversation, besides for the fact that he is our rabbi, Rabbi Artson this spring will receive his doctorate in constructive theology at the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion, and his dissertation is titled Tiyul B'Pardes, Strolling in Paradise, the Process of Creation. Again, thank you all for teaching us today, and we've been looking forward to this for a while, so we welcome.
Alexander, thank you for those kind remarks. There is one small correction I think I want to have on the record. I appreciate if you came to hear Rabbi Dorf, and I appreciate if you came to hear Rabbi Artson. Why on earth you'd come to hear me, I have absolutely no idea whatsoever. So I'm the moderator, which with these two animals of incivility, really is just, really my role is more timekeeper and occasional putzer. But I do have the opportunity of being able to just open up with a few words of introduction. And I'd like to do so sharing a personal experience. When I was in rabbinical school, I took classes with Rabbi Dov Zlotnick, Chancellor Schorsch, and Professor Jack Wertheimer, just to name a few. I named these three because, as the comments on the sounds and groans from my right indicate, these teachers were among the most difficult at the seminary. Especially, I should say, Rabbi Zlotnick, who had me memorize in our class, any class with him, memorize more things about more stuff in the Mishnah. Interestingly enough, his book as well was required memorization than any teacher I'd ever had in my entire experience learning to become a rabbi. But as hard as these teachers were in their various subjects, and as demanding as they were on an academic level, the hardest class I actually took was not with those gentlemen. The hardest class I took is what was at the seminaries, in the seminary's curriculum, the second year requirement on theology. And it was hard because we weren't just being asked to study what Heschel said and compare and contrast that with what Franz Rosenzweig said. Or look at Buber and really understand what the I thou is. Or just see if you could possibly get at least one paragraph through anything that Emmanuel Levinas wrote. Though those were really difficult. The really difficult part in this class in Jewish theology was that the goal was for us to begin defining what we thought. We were to use those instructors, we were to use those teachers and those thinkers not to know what they believed and what they felt about various topics of revelation and creation and how God interacts in history and in this world, but we had to use those as springboards to come to our own understanding. What did God mean for us? Not what did Heschel say about revelation. What did I believe happened at Sinai? What do I believe is the best way to understand when awful things happen in this world? What is my take on how it is that I can hear and experience the divine in this world, here and now, for myself? It is very easy, I will tell you as a rabbi in some ways, to speak about mitzvot. We like that. Very concrete, objective, out there. And that conversation can easily shift into dogma. What do we as conservative Jews believe? But to be able to articulate for myself, what do I think? Much more challenging, much riskier, especially if we actually share it with other people and they don't understand or they don't accept what we say. Theology is an essential endeavor, though, because without having that sense of what it is that I believe personally on these and other crucial matters, limits my effectiveness, both just as a human being, in terms of being able to draw close to God, but also my effectiveness as a rabbi. Because ultimately theology comes from what Michael Fishbane wrote in this book of his, Sacred Attunement. Theology has to come from the thickness of life. And it has to be our way of articulating how God interacts with us here and now in each and every moment. To be able to do that, and to do that well, we require brilliant teachers. People who have thought, studied, tried on different theologies in the way sometimes that we try in clothing, have experimented and have considered these issues from all angles. And so this afternoon, I'm very privileged, even just to serve if it is as timekeeper, to two brilliant men who have instructed and taught myself and so many others in these questions and have given their time and their life and their energy and their soul towards investigating this so that we as their students may profit from their work as we take in and listen to how they for themselves have answered these questions. Just a quick word about the format for this afternoon. Rabbi Dorf is going to speak first for 10 minutes. Rabbi Artson is going to speak afterwards for 10 minutes. They're each going to present their theologies. Obviously not going to cover everything in 10 minutes, but at least give us a taste and a sense of it. They are then going to have the option of asking questions to one another about what has been said. Then afterwards, we're going to open it up a little bit to questions that I have based upon my own reading of their works, and also inviting all of you to ask your questions as well. So, with that in mind, it is a pleasure to turn things over to Rabbi Elliot Dorf.
Hi. I'm going to take my watch off, but you know by now that when a rabbi takes his watch off, it means absolutely nothing. But what I wanted to make sure of is that I stay within the time frame and enable us to really have a conversation. I learned from a friend of mine by the name of Jim McLendon, who was a Protestant theologian, whom I met through at Graduate Theological Union, whom I met through a dialogue program that our faculty had with Graduate Theological Union during the 70s and 80s, that very often theology is a function of biography, that is, of your beliefs about God are functions of your experiences in life. And so I'm going to take the privilege of just saying why I believe what I believe based upon my biography. I grew up in a very warm and loving, typical second-generation conservative home, and that meant that my mother we kept the culture at home, but we ate anything out. Well, not human beings, but other than that, anything out. You're a philosopher, you think in these categories. And my father worked on Shabbat. He smoked a cigar and he smoked on Shabbat. And then when I had sort of run out of time at the Jewish Community Center day camp, I went to Ramah at age 12. And at the time, in order to be able to go back, I had a wonderful time and had more interesting discussions there than I had anywhere else. And so I wanted to go back, but in order to do that, you had to take at least 6 hours a week of Jewish studies during the year at the time. So that meant that I didn't quit Hebrew school after my bar mitzvah the way that most of my friends did. It was for completely pragmatic reasons. It had nothing to do with commitment to Judaism or anything else. I just wanted to go back to camp. But what that meant was that when I was 15, I was there for a series of discussions that Rabbi David McGillner, who was the director of the camp, led. And he started out by saying, how many of you keep kosher at home and out? And a certain number of people raised their hands. These are for 15 and 16-year-olds. How many of you don't keep kosher at all? A certain number of people raised their hands. How many of you keep kosher at home and not out? And I was among them. And he said, it's you people I don't understand because you are inconsistent. That is, you haven't really thought through what your commitments are. And then it was Monday nights, for some reason I remember that, over 8 weeks, he started out with very concrete things, kashrut, Shabbat, that kind of stuff, and then went to more abstract things like revelation and prayer and God. And each week he was on the attack. I mean, he was basically saying, why would anybody in his or her right mind believe any of these things or do any of these things? Retrospectively, I should say, I understand now that that was a wonderful educational tack to use with teenagers because it forced us to defend the tradition rather than the other way around. But what it did do was that it showed me that you didn't have to close your mind in order to be seriously Jewish. And it was after that summer that I began to keep kosher out and became very much involved in things Jewish. From that moment, at that time on, age 15 to about age 35, that means undergraduate degree, rabbinical school, PhD in philosophy, right, and then teaching here. If you asked me what I believed about God, I would tell you, A, I didn't know, because that was the one piece that I couldn't figure out. I mean, the rituals of Judaism can be understood and appreciated in a whole variety of different ways. Some of them just aesthetic, some of them communal, some of them in terms of the ethical values that they articulate. Certainly the moral parts of our tradition speak very directly to me, at least, and I would imagine to you as well. But it was the God issue that I just couldn't make my peace with. And it wasn't, this was 1958 when I was 15. where, I mean, by that time, people were not talking about the Holocaust. It wasn't so much that. I mean, Elie Wiesel's book, Night, came out in 1959 in French and 61 in English. The first real theology of the Holocaust was Richard Rubenstein in 66. So people weren't talking about God vis-a-vis the Holocaust so much at that time. The basic issue for me was that I had no clue what it meant and how God played any role in my life. If you asked me what I believed during those years, I would say, well, I at least believed in Kaplan's God, power that makes for salvation, because you don't have to believe very much to believe in Kaplan's God. You know, every once in a while the acorn becomes the oak tree. I mean, that's basically it. Doesn't always become the oak tree, but it does once in a while, and that's a wonderful thing. Every once in a while, I mean, people develop, you know, and people develop in various ways. I mean, God is the power that enables me to put into action the things that are potential in me. So God would be the power that would transform me from a bad baseball player into a good baseball player. That is yet to manifest itself. But anyway, but the point is that it's a, you know, and I also knew that it was not enough for two important things. Namely, it did not, for as much as I tried, I was davening every day, but as much as I tried, I could not pray to a force. It was always the image of some human being that was in my mind. And sometimes just the man on the mountain with the flowing white beard, and sometimes other people. So it didn't, Kaplan's theology didn't work for me in terms of prayer, and it also didn't work for me in terms of mitzvot, especially ritual mitzvot. Remember, this is Milwaukee. There were no kosher restaurants there at the time. It was bad enough, as there were no Jewish day schools either. I was going to public school and very active in all kinds of things. It was bad enough that Friday night Dorf checked out and couldn't go to the basketball game on Friday night. That was a sin like no other sin among my teenage friends. But when I checked in again on Saturday night, and we did something, and then went out to eat. The new place in town was Big Boy, so I didn't get a Big Boy like any normal person would. I got a fish sandwich or a salad or something stupid like that, and I had to explain myself over and over and over again. But the God, so I mean, I knew that Kaplan's God, you know, for Kaplan these were folkways. Kashrut was a folkway, but most of my Jewish friends were not keeping kosher. So it didn't work for me on that level either. But yet I didn't know what I could affirm anything, you know, what I could affirm about God beyond that. Finally, in my mid-30s, I decided that I simply could not bracket that question anymore, because God, after all, is a fairly central piece of the Jewish tradition. And so, in addition to doing a lot of work in analytic philosophy, which I had done as part of my doctoral program, but this time in religion, and in addition to reading in some other areas as well, what I found was that the thing that was really most important to me in terms of developing my theology was the prayer book. Because, see, the prayer book comes without all of the problems of the Torah. With the Torah, you are ready, as soon as you start opening that book, you have to start asking yourself about revelation, and how is the text of the book connected at all to God, and what happens if they're different things from God, and all of that kind of stuff. The prayer book doesn't make any pretensions to that whatsoever. It claims to be a human document addressed to God. And so what I did simply was look at the prayer book and say to myself, ask myself three questions. One, what is this for each of the various prayers? What does this prayer, what normal, by the way, I assumed that the rabbis who wrote this prayer were normal human beings having normal human experiences. And so what I would say is, what is the normal human experience that the rabbis writing this prayer, or whoever it is that wrote this prayer, had? Thank you. Then second, why did they express that experience in God talk? Why didn't they just talk about Yotzer Or as being, the sun rose, or Ahavat Olam that we have, or Ahavah Rabbah that we have a Torah, or that there are pieces of redemption in our lives, right? Why did they just say that rather than talking about God in that? And then third, does it make any sense for me now to talk about God in the same ways in which the prayer does? And what I found was that what the prayer book does is that it points to a variety of different experiences, which I think are sort of pointer factors. That's the analytic philosophy term. They're pointer factors to various aspects of our existence that are footprints of God, as it were. That is, that give us a sense of what we mean by the transcendent, God here being the transcendent. And then it seemed to me that, like the rabbis, and unlike people like Maimonides, that God had to be anthropomorphized in image. Why? Because A, I couldn't pray to a force or a being without some kind of anthropomorphic image, not emotionally and not intellectually either. But B, also because if God, and this I learned from Herberg originally, I'm going to quote to you something from a much later book from one of my former teachers who died recently, Rabbi Yochanan Mufs, who was a teacher of Bible of mine. In the last book of his, in 2005, The Personhood of God, upheld the anthropomorphic, I'm looking at one of his eulogies, and this is in the foreword, upheld the anthropomorphic conceptualization of God, his mood swings and passions, as depicted in the Bible and in Midrash. This was not, he argued, a primitive deficiency, but a theological ideal. A model of divinity that does not, I'm quoting him now, a model of divinity that does not partake of personhood can hardly be expected to cultivate personhood in man, he wrote. A psychologically oriented, mythically formulated phenomenology of the world-affirming God as he appears in the Bible and in later rabbinic tradition can serve as the basis of a faith which humanists of all kinds can hold in common. Now that, by and large, is the kind of faith in God that I have. Interestingly, after all of this long journey, it turned out to be a fairly traditional view of God, a view of God that's separate from us, separate from the world, but that can be best understood through anthropomorphic images and best related to in anthropomorphic images. Are there problems with that belief in God? You bet. But it seems to me that, but I think that there are problems with any human belief, with any human system of belief, and I think that the advantages of that kind of sort of traditional theology outweigh its disadvantages.
So the first thing I want to do is thank you for being here, and I want to thank Rabbi Dorf for the honor of being on this panel. If you had asked me 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 3 years ago, what would never happen in your lifetime, this would pretty much be what I would never have pictured. So thank you for this real pleasure. So let me frame it a little bit differently. I'm going to get personal too in a minute. But let me frame it by saying that the Torah doesn't have a theology. What the Torah has are stories and laws. And rabbinics, by and large, doesn't articulate a theology. It has stories and laws. So why not just leave it at that? Why not just tell stories and practice laws and go your way? There are people who do that, and there are people for whom that works, and that's fine, I suppose. But most of us are not able to do that because we have a need to integrate what we know from other areas of our life with the larger world. So once you introduce the question of, yes, but what relationship do these stories have to reality? Or how am I supposed to understand the authority of these stories? Or did they actually happen? Or were there kernels of truth to them? All of those kinds of nagging questions. Then all of a sudden you move from some wonderful stories and awful stories, and wonderful laws and awful laws, to in what way does this reflect the cosmos? In what way does this reflect that transcendent sense of oneness and being and majesty that's out there? How does this track something bigger? And that then moves us to try to be systematic about it. So it seems to me that part of this whole discussion is attempting to do something that is admittedly beyond the explicit agenda of either the Torah or the rabbis. Right? And that's because we don't live in their world. So we are trying to take their texts and their legacy and live it somehow, which means it has to make sense to us in our world, and that means we ask different ontological questions than they ever wrote about necessarily. So the ways that's been done is most prominently with classical theism, that God is omnipotent, omniscient, all of the omnis that you've heard me talk about several times before, that God is eternal, meaning outside of space and time, that God is unchanging, because being outside of space and time, you're unchanging. My one quibble with my teacher, my master, is it's a little putting the cart before the horse to argue that that view is traditional, when in fact there are many things that traditional rabbis would articulate, were any of them here, more traditional than the rabbis who are here, which we agree not to agree on. So we are all of us working with attempting to reformulate tradition so that we are loyal to the tradition to the extent that we possibly can be, while at the same time living with integrity and with the ethical nature of our obligations to the world. So I'm going to put aside which theology is traditional and which isn't traditional, because I think that makes it harder to have the real conversation. I will recognize that the dominant theology, the one that we think we're supposed to believe, the art scroll theology, is a God who is simple, radically unchanging, radically separate from everything, outside of space and time, knows the future the way he knows the past, controls every single detail. I don't believe in that God. I can't believe in that God. Now I want to make two more statements preparatory to going into that. The first is, I grew up an atheist. So I didn't keep kosher in or out. For my bar mitzvah, which was held on a Saturday morning, we drove from the synagogue after the 45-minute bar mitzvah service was over to the Jewish club, which we celebrated with shrimp Louis, and that's shrimp in a ketchup-y sauce. Then it's delicious. Then we served a chicken cordon bleu. For those of you who are FFB, that's you take the chicken breast, you lay on it a slice of H-M, you put over that a layer of cheese, you put it all in cream, you roll it up. Fabulous. And then we finished with baked Alaska, which is ice cream en flambé, as they say in France, all on Shabbos. And we didn't do it because we were being rebellious, we did it because that's just how we lived our life. But the time that I met God, and I was so alienated I knew nothing how to do with that, I had a medical emergency, and I was going through a very, very painful and humiliating procedure at the hands of a doctor who was doing good medicine. There was no good way to do what he had to do. And strapped in as I was for about an hour and a half, I was in unbelievable agony. And at some point, I had a vision, a physical vision, of myself marching through the sea, parted with the Israelites leaving Egypt, and God at our head. And the vision was so visual that it was completely, I was there, until I left the doctor's office, and then being an atheist, I had nowhere to put it, so I forgot that I had ever had the vision. And I didn't remember that I had had the vision until years later when I was a chaplain in a hospital, and I went in, all of 23, 24 years old to help this 84-year-old deal with her life-threatening illness, and she properly kicked me out of her room and said to me, "What would you know about this?" And I blurted out, "I had cancer too." And then I had to sit down, because I hadn't let myself know that I had had cancer. Yes, I had gone to a cancer center for my treatment. Yes, my doctor was an oncologist. It just hadn't sunk in that it was cancer. And then when I sat down, I remembered that actually I had already been with God. So God for me is first an experience. And then only after that, something I think about. And that continues to be the case. So what is up for grabs for me is not God's presence, God's love. In every emergency in my life, I have always felt the immediate presence of God in an unquestionable way. The times where I don't know for sure whether there's a God or not is when things are going well in my life. So the two, I think, greatest challenges to faith are science and evil. Science in the fact that right now one can have a plausible intellectual explanation for everything that exists without ever invoking anything vaguely spiritual, mystical, or religious. You can explain how everything came to be, from soup to nuts, from the minute Planck time ends to now. Everything is continuous, everything is explanatory according to the laws of physics, quantum physics, Darwinian evolution. You don't need to invoke anything else to have a complete, comprehensive, and coherent explanation. That's a huge challenge, because there are many people who draw from that there is nothing else. And the second challenge is, of course, evil. If God is this omnipotent, loving creature that we say God is, then he is at the very least a gross underachiever. And how you account for that evil is a problem. I want to now move on to the areas that Rabbi Dorf and I are in complete agreement, because actually I think this is not really a debate among differences. This is between someone whose paint tone is red with a little white, and the other one is white with a little red, but they're really shades of differences more than they are starkly different. And I think the places I will lay out where I think there are substantive differences, but I think they are actually few. Where we agree, and I did read this book very carefully a couple times, where we agree is that truth is pragmatic. That is to say, human beings don't have an objective appraisal of truth. We know truth by its predictability, by its ability to explain things, perhaps by its predictable ability to explain things that haven't yet happened, its coherence, its ability to explain a larger body of data. That we treat as true. And we assume, because it works very well, that it's actually tracking something, that it's not simply a very useful fantasy. But truth for us is mostly pragmatic. We also recognize that revelation is in a significant degree cultural. You do have to ask yourself what a remarkable coincidence it is that the Torah was given in the language of ancient Hebrew. Right? That's actually statistically very improbable, much more likely that the Ribbono Shel Olam would have given us a book in Mandarin Chinese, and then wouldn't we have had a problem? So the fact that our revelation comes to us in our own cultural package is not insignificant, and Rabbi Dorf and I both treat that as not marginal to the content of the revelation, but in fact constructive of that content. Yes? Yes? You, Rabbi Dorf. Three. Neither Rabbi Dorf nor I think of reason as some objective, cold, dispassionate logic that can be applied as kind of rules of the cosmos filtered through the brain. Reason entails emotion. And emotion and reason are different phases of a larger phenomenon by which human beings make sense of the world into which they are born. And then finally, both Rabbi Dorf and I are deeply troubled by evil, but that leads me to where we differ, because I think we have chosen different emphases for how we respond to that. In none of what I'm about to say should you hear a sliver of implication other than that Rabbi Dorf is, to my mind, one of the handful of most ethical rabbis alive, a man who has consistently insisted that Jewish tradition stands for justice and for inclusion and compassion. On that, I stand in his shadow, and it's one of the things I love and revere him for. But we do differ in how we treat it. So in Rabbi Dorf's book, and he may have moved since then, he does speak about approaching God in two different ways. So you approach the kind of process of God, or the force of God in one way, and then the personal God is the one you pray to and know. He dispenses the Holocaust at one point in the book by saying God did cause the Holocaust, but that's not the God we can pray to. That doesn't work for me. I don't know how, I understand having two different approaches to God, but at some point you have to explain how those two different approaches are in fact the same God. And telling me that God as force caused the Holocaust, but God as Hashem is the courage that we feel within it, I still don't want, if that's one God, I still want nothing to do with the guy. And there I think we have a difference, in part because for Rabbi Dorf, at least as reflected in the writing, the limited God is Kaplanian. And I share with Rabbi Dorf the inability to be moved by a Kaplanian God. But that's because I think Kaplan was held captive to the kind of materialism that was prevalent in the intellectual circles of his time, which are not necessary. And that's why, for me, my roots are in Whitehead and in process thinking, which is a way to try to develop a metaphysics that incorporates a very different understanding of God's dynamism. So, like Rabbi Dorf, I think there are two ways to approach God. God as absolute being is a logical necessity, but not the one we hang out with. God as becoming, God as interaction, God as relationship. For those of you who are Mekubalim, if you want to distinguish between Ein Sof and God as manifest in the Sfirot, same idea. We live with the Sfirot. You need Ein Sof intellectually to ground the whole system. I believe that there are aspects of God that are eternal and beyond relationship. Wrap-up time. But the last thing that I will say is, I am able to pray to a force. I'm not always able to pray to a person. Sometimes I need to, in prayer, pray with the thought of praying to another person, but I bring my personality to it. In the same way that I can get into the Pacific Ocean and think that she is my mother, the same way that I can look at these mountains and I can have a conversation with them, frankly, the same way some of you have seen my relationship with my dog, and I'm able to have a very personal, if not to say intimate, relationship with my dog. I don't think that one can only have a personal relationship with people. And with that, I will stop.
Thank you very much, Ashika. Implicit in Rabbi Artson's presentation were several questions already towards you. So, especially on the issue of exactly how you construct God, the notion of the absolute God, the force, and dealing with evil and the Holocaust. So, okay, with respect to that, Rabbi Dorf, we'll give you the first shot to both respond and also ask questions.
First of all, the God I believe in is, I would say, a biblical / rabbinic understanding of God, not the medieval philosophical understanding of God. It's not until you get to the medieval philosophers that you talk about all the omnis, omnipresent, omnipotent, and all of that kind of stuff. The rabbis were, I think, much clearer about that. Hakol b'yadei shamayim chutz me'yirat shamayim. So already in the Mishnah, there are things that God does not control. That's the reason why we can have free will and we can be held responsible for our free will. I think the God of the Bible and of the rabbis is, frankly, a much philosophically, as I think a much more a God that can be much more easily justified than the God of people like Maimonides. Now, I'm saying a lot there because Maimonides is not stupid, to put it mildly, but But I just don't buy his arguments. I mean, in the end, and I think that when you get to those kinds of omni things, then you get to all kinds of philosophical conundrums, let alone an emotionally pallid kind of God. Whereas I think the rabbis' God, which was, I think, very easy to identify with, and to argue with, and to feel loved by, to feel commanded by, to feel angry with, and vice versa, that God could feel angry with us, and to have a covenant with. And I think that those images of God are not omnis. Those images of God are images of, and the ones that are expressed through the prayer book, right? It doesn't say that God heals everybody, but that God is involved in the healing process. It doesn't say that God gives us what we need in terms of food every year, because people die of starvation. But when we have food to eat, we have to recognize the fact that it was not human beings alone that was involved in that, but that there were divine powers that were involved in that, and divine will that was involved in that, for me. And hence the bracha of Mavarech Hashanim. This is not Kaplan by a long shot, because Kaplan's view of God was that of nature. And I think that basically what you learn from the disproofs of the classical proofs for the existence of God is that none of those proofs can work, because God is not simply nature, God is not simply morality, God is not simply being, God is not simply causation. Being is the ontological proof, right? Causation is the cosmological proof. God is not simply order either, the teleological proof, and God is not simply morality, which is the moral proof, Kant's proof. right? I don't think God is any one of those things exclusively. But I think each one of those proofs was trying to point at some factors in our lives that are indeed footprints of God. And even if they can't be used as proofs for the existence of God, I think they are part of the manifestations of God, in the same sort of a way that you don't really have a proof for the existence